Important to realize also that at the same time, inflation is increasing the state budget by a similar amount. And I don't know what, I haven't been in California the last few months, but I heard some talk about the gasoline taxes alone pumping up the state's revenues by a considerable amount, approaching $1 billion. We did a calculation last fall that seemed to suggest that the $1 billion was going to be a windfall to the state of California from gas prices alone, sales taxes on gas prices. So there is inflation going on continually that keeps restoring all the tax revenue that we keep chopping off every time we have an initiative. And as long as that goes up, we can predict a continuing need for these kinds of initiatives to keep chopping off the tail of the octopus that keeps growing back. However, Jarvis will index the income tax, so that will take care of that portion of it. Now, the net effect of the education tax credit, I think, strangely enough, is probably going to be to actually make more money available for remaining students in public schools. And this occurs because you take a tax credit for your actual educational expenses in private, non-public schools. But those schools educate for half the cost of the public schools. So you take a maximum of a $1,200 tax credit per child, but the child that comes out of the public schools is going to save that school as much as $2,500, $3,000 in some urban school districts. The average state expenditure is more like $2,000 now. And you say, well, okay, one child out isn't going to save much money. That isn't true. Over 85% of the public schools' expenditures are for things like salaries. So there is a lot of flexibility in budgets, and if the enrollments decrease, we know under Prop 4, under the GAN initiative, that the budgets will have to decrease by a pro rata amount. And so we can expect to see large savings in the public schools. We can expect to see some of that money passed back in general tax cuts, some if not all. I'm counting on the bureaucrats to try to slow up that process a little bit. But in fact, we're going to see large savings in general tax costs. I've been passing you by here.
One question I've been asked a couple of times is based on, yeah, that all sounds really great, but what about the poor family that doesn't have access to any kind of corporate money and realizes that a $1,200 amount of money is really not going to educate that child? Isn't this really going to leave out some people? My answer has been maybe. Maybe it will.
Well, there are no guarantees, first of all, to be quite precise about it. But first of all, second of all, $1,200 is plenty to educate a child in parochial schools in California today. It's not enough, yes, to educate them in a rather elitist school, but many, if not most, of the basic private schools that do the bulk of the education for private schools, what is the current figure? It's about 150, it's 500,000, 150,000 in the one association, 500,000 students in private schools in California today, and the bulk of those students are educated at a cost of like $1,000 or $750, as low as $500 a year. So the education tax credit can indeed cover that if people are taking the full tax credit. And even so, well, there's another thing, too. In many cases, for many families, it's just that additional $200 or $300 that would make it possible. You know, a lot of families are close. One further answer on that. It now begins to look like, as this thing gets nearer to reality, it begins to look like the bulk of the corporate money is going to go directly to the schools so that the schools can cut their costs to the bone for poorer students. That's the way it's already being talked about. The other thing is that a lot of the money won't come from corporations at all. It will come from grandparents and from relatives who can take tax credits just like anybody else. So if a family wants to send one child to school, they could take their uncles and their grandparents and all chip in, you know. And it's
directly to the family.
Sure, sure, right.
And beyond that, any corporation can offer a very substantial fringe benefit by offering to subsidize the education of its poor employees.
Every student will have the charitable deduction.
Charitable credit.
Does that mean that if one thing you send your child to a school that costs $7,000 a year, you just had to round up the number of people willing?
No, it's $1,200 per child. So the credit is constructed so that The tax credits will never cover more than the first $1,200 of any one child's education. Right. If they want to spend $7,000, that's their business. But the credit can never cover the more than the first $1,200 per child. Yes, it is every year.
The other thing that it sounds kind of like instead of being a mass support of the public schools, this is more or less a support of the parochial schools.
No, it's... Well, that's true if you think that there's a lot of rationale behind that thinking, and let's bring it out into the open. There is an argument that this just forces people to support parochial schools. That argument is far more appropriate to vouchers, where the tax money is taken from people at large, handled by the government, and then the government makes all the decisions about where the money goes, and it goes into parochial schools. That argument applies there, but it does not apply in the case of tax credits. It's important to remember, probably the most important thing of all to remember, is the tax credit is just a tax cut, and you're allowing people to keep the money themselves. It is their own. It isn't the government's money. It isn't society's money. It's their own money. And they're the ones who are making the decisions to give it to this kind of school or another kind of school, or to spend it on home education alternatives that are like schools or whatever. It is not society or government that is forcing anybody else to support that decision. It is only the taxpayer using the taxpayer's own money. That's a whole world of difference. And that's a very, very important difference, because indeed you will find the opponents, the teachers' unions, saying the tax credit's just a way to force taxpayers to support parochial schools. Now, one more angle to that. I predict, and I think there's a lot of evidence for this, that it will not be the parochial schools who will grow the fastest and the farthest after tax credits. Parochial schools have dominated private education because they presently are able to be supported through tax-deductible donations, okay? That's true to some extent with non-religious private schools, but not to the complete extent that religious schools are. And so you could predict very reasonably that the fastest growing segment after you have tax credits will be those private, non-secular schools that never could exist because there was never a market for their services. They're the ones whose market has really been dried up. So the current situation where parochial schools dominate the private schools is not necessarily the future situation. Yeah.
Age limit of the student?
There is none.
Well, what about want to go to college?
It applies through college, $1,200.
Professional training for your job?
Same thing. Ben.
What's the name of the attorney that you mentioned?
William B. Ball.
And I live out of state, as you know. And,
Right.
Can we get a copy of this letter that he?
Yeah, I have a copy here. I have just about 2 copies, so I can, I'll have to make a copy.
Take one to our Knights of Columbus organization.
Yeah. Right.
Second question, Tom Shannon in San Diego made a big deal of the constitutional or unconstitutionality of this, and I would like to have some sort of ground, because I didn't hear any good rebuttal to him down there.
Well, Manny, being an attorney, has a whole series of arguments on this, and I have slightly different arguments. Since I'm,
High points.
I'll try to do that. I'm going to shoot first, or?
Well, one I say briefly,
Go
there
ahead.
is a constitutional issue that's posed by any plan that would involve some benefit to students going to parochial schools. The problem is the First Amendment issue dealing with separation of church and state. There is no guarantee that what we're doing will not be shot down by the courts, but we have drafted the initiative in a way that gives very strong arguments to our position, and we've modeled it after a statute in Minnesota that was upheld by a 3-judge federal district court confronting the very same arguments that are being raised against ours. So we feel that, recognizing there's no guarantee, we feel we have a very strong legal position. And there's strong enough support for the initiative. If it passes, we feel comfortable, just as with Prop 13, the courts are going to go with us.
The other thing is that tax credits are a phrase that are applied rather loosely. There are tax credits, and then there are tax credits. The programs that were struck down in the New York case back in 1973, in the Pennsylvania case, and so on and so forth. These were combinations of tax credits and grant payments to low-income students. These are a completely different breed of animal than what we have here. We have developed something that is new, that is novel. It's completely a divorced idea from this old tax credits thing that was struck down previously. You've heard of recent cases in 78 and 79 where tax credits were struck down as recently as that. But once again, those laws were practically imitations of the old kind of tax credits. The old support for tax credits has never been able to get away from that idea, and it's only because we've brought some new blood into this business, namely libertarians, that we've been able to think up some new approaches that beat the rap that has been aimed at the old tax credits. And so I think there's a strong basis to believe that this is a new, untested idea, and provided we do our work well in terms of political organizing, that it will survive.
The key really is that our initiative provides assistance not only to students in parochial schools, but also students in public schools. And with the increasing cost of attendance at parochial schools, there's an argument that hasn't been given a lot of weight yet by the courts, but there's more sympathy to it among legal scholars. And that is that if you are so concerned about separation of church and state that the state can't assist or allow any money to go to a church school, then parents who want to send their kids to a parochial school, their right to exercise their religion freely is impeded. So that's another more or less technical argument, but said it very carefully.
We have run flat out of time. I'd like to carry this on outside if you have more questions. So I think we really ought to vacate the room here.